pick back up with Genesis. There's a structural pattern in Genesis that's actually pretty interesting that will actually help us with something in the New Testament as well. This is what are referred to as the Toledot headings, and that's the Hebrew word Toledot there in parentheses. These headings, there are 11 of them, and Toledot is the generation of. And so we have Elei Toledot, phrase in Hebrew, these are the generations of. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth, generations of Adam, of Noah, of the sons of Noah, of Shem, of Terah, of Ishmael, of Isaac. And then we have twice in Genesis 36, we have generations of Esau and the generations of Esau again. And then we have generations of Jacob. So there's these 11. The reason that I have these four kind of set off to the side and italicized, because if you notice, there's longer sections here, there's shorter sections here, right? So we have longer sections on this side, we have shorter sections on this side. That means that these are the less important ones. The ones on the left side are more important. There's a lot going on with these. First of all, one of the things that we notice is Noah, sons of Noah, Ishmael, and Esau. There's this thing in the ancient world called primogeniture. Primogeniture is the firstborn son gets everything. And so if you're the firstborn son, you get all the things. What Genesis is trying to do, part of what Genesis is trying to do, is overturn that. And so it's not the firstborn that gets everything.
I thought the firstborn got double portion.
Yeah.
Okay, that's where you're going to be with this. Okay.
Yeah. And so what Genesis is trying to do, Shem is likely the second-born, and so that overturns primogeniture, right? Firstborn is not the most important. Ishmael is the firstborn and not Isaac, and yet Isaac gets everything, basically. And then Esau is firstborn and not Jacob, and yet Jacob gets everything. And so these showing up in the structure of Genesis is this is one of the ways that the book of Genesis is trying to tell us that this whole firstborn thing isn't as important in Israel as it is everywhere else. And this, by the way, is also one of the ways in which the Bible is pro-women, because Adam is created first and Eve is created second. But all of Genesis is overturning the fact that the firstborn is more important. So we can't say that Adam being born first makes Adam more important or anything like that. That's just not how that works. Abraham being a major character in Genesis is not named, which is kind of strange, right? We don't have Abraham in here. But we do have somebody very important to Abraham in here. Anybody recognize one of the names here that would be related to Abraham? No.
Isaac?
Isaac, and then just above Isaac, Terah. Right? Terah is Abraham's father.
I thought that was a girl.
No, these are all dudes. All of the genealogies in the ancient world focused on the men and not on the women. So, though Matthew's genealogy, when we get to the New Testament, Matthew actually does have some women in it, and he has all of the women that you normally would not name. He has all the scandalous women, which is pretty awesome. So, but Terah is Abraham's father. The reason that we have Terah named here and not Abraham is what are the people of the Tower of Babel trying to do?
Staircase to heaven.
Staircase to heaven. They're trying, and in building that staircase to heaven, what are they trying to do?
Convince God to come down.
Yeah, they're trying to convince God to come down, right? As opposed to going up to be with him. They're trying to convince God to come down, and specifically in Genesis 11, it says that they're trying to make their name great, right? Genesis 12 is where we get Abraham, and Abraham is promised that God will make his name great. And so the reason that Abraham is actually not named yet is because his name's not great yet. God's promised that it'll happen, but it actually hasn't happened yet, at least in the story. And so he names Terah Abraham's father and not Abraham because Abraham's name's not great. Also, Abraham's name changes, so you maybe don't want to put Abram in there and give things away or anything like that. So what the function of these headings, what's probably happening is if we go back to the list, what's probably happening here is we have kind of a everything, heavens and earth, and we narrow from everything to Adam. And then Adam's family grows, and we narrow in everything to Noah. And then Noah's family grows, and then we narrow out of everything to Shem. Then Shem's family grows, and then we narrow down to Terah, right? You see how this is kind of working, right? We have growth, and then we narrow to one specific descendant, and growth, and then one specific descendant. What this is telling us, this is the way Genesis is structured to show us the line of redemption. Like this is where redemption is going to come from, is through those specific people. Not the ones off to the right. The ones off to the right are there to kind of help us track in the story. But the ones on the left there are there to show us the line of redemption, to show us like where everything's going. Now, it is somewhat important that you remember this, at least slightly, because when we get to the New Testament, Matthew is going to play on this. And so there's some really cool stuff that happens at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel. So if you can just kind of file this away, right, when we talk about Matthew, which will probably be tomorrow, we will go back to the Toledot headings and Exodus, okay? Or not Exodus, Genesis. I was thinking Exodus because I was looking at Exodus. There we go. So Exodus, what's in a name? This is, remember Shemot is the name for Exodus in Hebrew, so Shemot is names, and everything in Exodus is about names. So we don't have the name of Pharaoh because we want to forget him, right? No one wants to remember that Pharaoh's name. He doesn't get to be remembered. Moses gets to be remembered. Even Moses' mom, Jochebed, gets to be remembered. But Pharaoh does not get to be remembered, right?
Why did Pharaoh not get to be remembered again?
Because it's shameful, right? Like we want to erase his name from history. We want to just refer to him as Pharaoh, generically, not as Ramses or Tutmos or whoever it was. Now this is frustrating for people historically because it would have been really helpful to know which Pharaoh it was to know when the Exodus happened. But from a literary standpoint, not putting his name in there is like making him just some random unnamed character that he's just called Pharaoh, right? Be like referring to somebody as like police officer or governor, like we're not gonna remember his name, right? Because he doesn't get that. What we're gonna do is we're gonna remember names of people that are important, right? At this stage, God dwells among his people in the tabernacle. We already talked a little bit about Yahweh's name, right? What did we say that Yahweh's name means?
I am.
He is.
He is. Yeah, he calls himself I am. We call him he is, right? Yeah, and so this gets revealed in Exodus 3, Yahweh, he is or he will be. Another thing that comes to the forefront in Exodus is this concept of chesed. You have to spit when you say it. You can't say hesed. You have to say chesed. And so if you're not spitting on people, you're not speaking Hebrew. But chesed is one of these terms that we don't really have in English. So it's kind of hard for us to translate this term into English when we're translating the Old Testament. It's related directly to covenant. So we just talked about covenant and the covenant with Abraham, right? And there's expectations, and then if you don't fulfill your expectations, there's penalties, right? Well, chesed is the term for fulfilling your expectations. So if you're in a relationship with somebody and you are behaving with chesed, you are maintaining all of the things that are expected of you, right? We don't really have that, right? Like we don't really have a name for that. The closest that I can think of, and we sort of do this in the Old Testament, is like faithful, right? God is faithful. But think about what our culture has done with the word faithful. If I say I'm a faithful husband, what does that mean? Yeah, so
like committed.
what does it mean in my relationship with my wife? What have I either done or not done?
Yeah.
I haven't cheated on her, right? So if I'm faithful, all that means is that I've successfully not cheated on my wife. Does that mean that I'm a good husband?
No.
Does that mean that I'm like kind, that I listen to her, that I rub her feet? You know, like it doesn't mean any of these. No, it just means that I've successfully not cheated on her. So you see how, like, for us, faithful has become the absence of a negative rather than the presence of a positive, right? Like, it's become like you've just not messed up, not that you've actually done the thing that you're supposed to do, right? And this is like C.S. Lewis has this really great essay called The Weight of Glory, which you can get in PDF online. It's like 9 pages long. If you just Google C.S. Lewis Weight of Glory, there's PDFs of it online. And it's fantastic. Everybody should read it like every year. It's phenomenal. But one of the things that he says in that essay is he says, we have replaced positive virtue with the absence of a vice. He says, if you, and he's writing in the 60s, so it's a long time ago, you know, relative to you guys. He says, if you'd asked 10 good men 50 years ago what the greatest virtue was, they would have said love. He says, but if you ask 10 good men today what the greatest virtue is, they would say unselfishness. Now, think about the difference between those two things. Love and unselfishness, right? Love is an action, right? Like that's like a thing that you do. Unselfishness is a thing you don't do, right? It's, I'm not selfish. It doesn't mean that you're generous, it just means that you're not selfish, right? This is the kind of thing that we've done in language, and it sort of makes it difficult to try to convey things like chesed, right? When we look at passages like with the first years that I've done in Devos in Exodus 34, we talked about this a little bit yesterday. Exodus 34, when God defines himself and he says he's abounding in grace and truth, abounding in steadfast love and truth. In Hebrew, it's chesed and ameth, right? Ameth is truth. Chesed is this word, right? It's not really steadfast love. It's not really faithfulness. It's he is abounding in doing the thing that he is supposed to do, right? He is abounding in fulfilling his obligations in the relationship. He does the thing that he is supposed to do, right? And this happens throughout the Old Testament. We have this word showing up all of the time, and we often see it as loving kindness, steadfast love, loyalty, these kinds of things. But again, we don't have an English term for I do the things that I like. How do I say to somebody, I'm a good husband? Like, how do I say that? Like, there's not a word that's like, I have this. We don't have that.
All of this.
Right.
Just one thing.
Yeah.
You can say caring, faithful, blah, 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 blah.
Right. Right.
Make a list of it and say
Right.
one word.
Yeah, there's not chesed, right? Like, there's not like, as a husband, I am a chesed husband. Like, that's not a thing, right? We don't have anything like that in English. All we have is I'm successfully not an idiot, right? Like, that's all we have. And that's our standard, right? Like, well, he doesn't cheat on me. Well, whoop-de-doo. Like, yay! Give him a cookie, right? Like, that's a pretty low bar. And so, like, this is a challenge in looking at the Old Testament. When we see loving kindness, steadfast love, this is not saying God successfully doesn't squash you, right? It goes far beyond God successfully doesn't squash you. And goes all the way to, what is Yahweh? Yahweh is, He will be, right? So what do you need? He is that, right? What do you need? He will be that, right? And so it's not just like the absence of him judging you, it's the presence of him providing for you, right? You know it's a good sermon if I'm using alliteration, right? Presence of provision, right? So yeah, anyway. So that's chesed, right? And this, we'll come back to chesed a couple more times in this lecture, but it's a really big deal. in the Old Testament. It's really a key term. At this point in Exodus, we have 1/3 of the promise to Abraham because there's a people. There's no land, there's no Messiah, but there is a people, right? So we're moving in the right direction, right? Moving in the right direction. We talked about this a little bit yesterday already. I forgot that I had this planned in a slide, but this is the passage in Deuteronomy that I told you about. It says, if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and who, when they have chastened him, will not heed them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him, bring him out to the elders of the city, to the gate of his city, and they shall say to the elders of the city, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious, he will not obey our voice, he is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones, so you shall put away the evil from among you, and all of Israel shall hear and fear. And remember, we were talking about with culture, the father of the house has the right to just kill you, right? And so, who has to agree with the father of the house in that culture on whether or not a child lives?
The mother and the elders.
Well, here they do, but outside of Israel, who has to agree with the father? Nobody. The father can just kill you, and nobody can stop him, right?
Nobody can say anything
Right. Like, that's up to the father. The father gets to just kill people in his family because he's the one responsible for the family. And so if you are not abiding by the rules of the family, then the father can either throw you out or kill you. The father has that right in the ancient world, and nobody can stop him. In Israel, though, the mom has to agree, and all of the elders of the town have to agree, right?
like that, which is super unlikely.
Yeah, right?
But mom's like, let's just kill my kid real quick.
For real, right? Like, now, as a parent, I can say there are times where I've wanted to kill my kids. But there are very few times where my wife and I both at the same time want to kill our kids, right? And even if there were, convincing the entire town, right? Like, at some point, someone's going to prevail, and we're going to be like, okay, yeah, we probably shouldn't kill him. Right? Like, there's moments of frustration where you're like, just why? Why would you... why would you do that?
Why not? Response from your kids.
Yeah, exactly.
Why not?
Yeah.
Why not? Why not?
Yeah, when you start seeing yourself looking back at you in a smaller human being, and you're like, why did I, why am I raising myself right now? This is not fair. Yeah, so this is a big deal, right? So we have to keep culture in mind when we're reading the text. We talked about this a little bit more yesterday, but just so you're aware. Another thing that's just interesting that I thought I'd throw up there just for the sake of, trivia. This is the Merneptah Stela. This is the first archaeological evidence of the name Israel in history. This is about the 13th century BCE, and so this is the first time that we get the word Israel anywhere in all of history. And so in 1300 BCE, 1400 BCE, we get this, which is an Egyptian pharaoh talking about, he actually says on here that he has destroyed the Israelites completely, and they no longer exist. And it's propaganda, right? It's military propaganda. So he has not destroyed Israel utterly, but that's what he's going to say. And who's going to say that he didn't? You put this up, and most people are probably going to believe it. So.
It'll be real. It
Well,
must have been real interesting to try to spread news around there.
Well,
Yeah, so you put this kind of stuff up. This is like, 8 or 10 feet tall, and you just stand it up at like crossroads, and people have,
Talk about time
This.
consuming, right?
yeah, because that's carved stone,
Yeah, exactly.
Right, so
So
that's-
they're like heave ho,
Right,
with like
right.
10 other dudes.
right?
Like having to get it out there. Let's make sure it stands up,
Yep,
y'all.
yep.
Oh, a big gust of wind.
Yep.
Splat.
Yeah, and so this is, if you're a king, this is the kind of stuff that you're going to put up because you want everybody to think that you're a conqueror, right? You want everybody to think that you've destroyed all of your enemies. So you're a trustworthy king because if the country is going to have enemies, then you're going to be the person that can destroy those enemies, right? And so that's what this guy does. And one of the enemies is Israel. And so it may be that the Exodus is directly before this, and that he goes after Israel in response to the Exodus. And so there are debates about whether or not this is relevant to dating the Exodus. We're not 100% sure. This is we get that far back in history, it's kind of hard to nail things down really, really well. But probably like the best date that I've seen, the most convincing date that I've seen for the Exodus is like 14 or 1500 BC. So this would be basically right after the Exodus. So then we get Israel in the land. Joshua gives Israel the land, and so we have 2/3 of the promise fulfilled, right? We have the people, and we have the land. Then in the Judges, book of the Judges, we have covenant rebellion in the land. If you've ever watched The Walking Dead, you can just imagine that reading Judges is like The Walking Dead, right? It's like the zombie apocalypse, because the key phrase in Judges is everyone did what was right in their own eyes, right? So there's no one holding anybody accountable to anything, so you can just do whatever you want. And there's some really nasty stuff in Judges, like really nasty stuff in Judges. Yeah, and so covenant rebellion in the land, both pieces of the promise begin to fall apart. And then in Samuel, we have Israel transformed into a kingdom. And briefly, we get 3 parts of the promise, right? We have land, nation, and Messiah briefly. We have all 3 of them. During Kings, we have Israel's covenant rebellion. All parts of the promise again begin to fall away. And then exile and return. If land and people are 2/3 of the promise, then what would exile mean? What would it look like to have exile if part of the 2 or the 3 parts of the promise are land and people?
Take all people to separate places on different land.
Yep. Yeah, it's devastating, right? Because if what you've been promised as a people group is that you would have a land of your own to rule on your own, and that all of your people could gather there, if large portions of the people are taken and put somewhere else, you no longer have the people, and they no longer have the land.
Was that the Babylonian captivity right there?
Babylonian and Assyrian.
Yeah.
There's 2 different captivities. Yeah. So Assyrian captivity happens in 722. Babylonian captivity happens in 587. Yeah. So exile and return. I mean, this is like a pretty consistent theme in Israel, such that there's a world religion scholar that says the description of Judaism is the way of exile and return. That is the definitional idea in Judaism is exile and return, exile and return. So, and then Ezra and Nehemiah, this is when they get to return to the land. And the prophetic message in any of this stuff is return to Yahweh, and specifically return to Chesed, right? Like, you should be keeping up your side of the covenant. Yahweh keeps up his side of the covenant. You should keep up your side of the covenant. You should be doing the things that you were supposed to be doing. You should not be doing the things that you're not supposed to be doing, right? Just like that first day we were talking about, like, don't do the thing. Don't do the thing. I'm going to go do the thing, right? Like, that's literally just like Israel's history, right? Because that's what we do. That's what humans do, right? We're like, okay, don't do the thing. I'm going to do the thing.
Terrible listeners.
What's that?
We're just terrible listeners.
Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah.
one ear, not the other.
Yeah, which is why our definition of faithfulness is just successfully not doing the thing, right? Like, this is why we've reduced things to just, you've successfully not blown it, right? Not that you've done good things, but that you've just not ruined anything. So, like, yay for you, you didn't ruin anything, right? Good job.
Cheap, nice.
Yeah,
Fist bump.
right. And so that's the prophetic message, right? They're trying to call people back into covenant faithfulness, trying to call people back to chesed, that exile wouldn't happen, right? Because really, exile is when they're abandoning the covenant, they get thrown into exile, right? When they're abandoning the covenant, that's when Yahweh's like, okay, time for you to have a timeout, right? Like, let's go somewhere else, right? The Davidic Reformation, when they have the full promise, Israel transitions from loosely affiliated tribes to a centralized nation. This is where we transition from tabernacle to temple. We talked about this a little bit the other day. God is dwelling in a permanent residence, not in a tent. Right? It's a permanent residence because they don't have to wander around anymore. This is the only part where we have the full promise to Abraham realized. And even this is not that great, right? King David is, he's great, but also not, right? Like he does some really terrible things.
Better than what it was.
He's better than Saul, which is not saying a lot, but he's not. He's good, but he's not perfect, right? I mean, the image there of King David that I've got, that's after the whole thing with Uriah and Bathsheba, and the prophet Nathan comes to David and basically is like, here's what you did, and you should repent, right? And David's like, yeah, I should repent. Which is probably like the best thing about David is that he gets confronted about something and actually is like, yeah, you're right, I should repent.
Fixes it what he
Right.
did wrong,
Whereas like Saul, when Saul gets confronted about things, he's like, no, I obeyed the Lord, right? And you're like, but you didn't actually. Like that's literally not like, yeah.
Better than like death.
Yeah.
You get
Yeah.
death for telling me I did something wrong.
Yeah, Saul is pretty bad. 1 Samuel 15 does a pretty good job of illustrating, like, he's supposed to utterly destroy the Amalekites, and he brings the king back, and he brings back all of their, like, gold and everything, and Samuel's like, you were supposed to utterly destroy them and all of their things. And Saul's response to Samuel is, I did utterly destroy them and all their things, and I brought back the king and some of their stuff. And you're like, do you know what utterly destroy means? Like, because those things don't work together. You can't say that's not how that works. So Saul's not the best, right? Another little interesting tidbit here for you. This is a place called Tel Dan, and tells are in archaeology. Basically, what would happen is if you build a city. You got your walls for the city here, and there's all these buildings and stuff, me and my beautiful artwork here. If you come through and you destroy this city, right, and it's just like all wrecked, well, it's going to be pretty hard. You don't have bulldozers or anything. You're not going to be able to like flatten it all the way out. So what you do in the ancient world is you just sort of like build it into a mound,
and then build on top.
and then you build on top of it, right? And then you got a city here, and then somebody comes in and does that, and then you just build another mound on top of it. And so you end up having like all of these like artificial hills, and this thing is called a tell. And so like Tel Aviv in Israel is a tell, right? That's a city in Israel. It's called Tel Aviv, and it's Tel Aviv. This is Tel Dan, and this is archaeological remains from Tel Dan. And we have here the thing that's on the left there. This is in the house of David. That's what that says in Hebrew. And this is the first place where we have the name David, historically speaking. And it's really interesting because there's two ways to spell David in Hebrew. There's an old way of spelling it, which is defective spelling, which is this. And then there's a more recent way of spelling it, which is called Pliny, which basically just means fuller. And that's this. And you have that one little like thing thrown in there. It's interesting that this is spelled this way because that's the older way of spelling it, right? So that tells us that this is probably an older inscription because it's spelling it the older way, right? Which is just interesting. So prophetic reformation. This is Jonah, of course, being spit out of a fish. Fun times for him. Israel is focused on the temple at this point, and they have lost the point of the law. And so the prophets at this point are especially calling them back to chesed, calling them back to the covenant, calling them back to faithfulness, calling them back to what you ought to do as an Israelite. And at this point, the promise to Abraham is partially lost because you don't have, in the prophets, you don't have the Messiah anymore. You've got a split kingdom, right? So you don't have a sole ruler over the people. And you're starting to get some of the exiles, right? And so we're running into those problems. Then we have the Babylonian Reformation. The Babylonian Reformation is the exile into Babylon. The Assyrian exile wasn't quite as bad as the Babylonian one was. Syrian one was a little bit nicer. The Babylonian one was pretty bad. So in the Babylonian Reformation, Solomon's temple is destroyed, and so the Jewish people have to rethink what it means for them to be Jewish. The promise to Abraham is completely lost, so they no longer have land, they no longer have people, and there's no Davidic king. So they've completely lost, and this, the artwork in the background here, this is a painting of Psalm 137:1, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept, and they're sitting beside a river weeping, right? By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept, and there we remembered Zion, and our captors asked from us a song, right? Sing us a song of Zion, right? How can you even do that, right? How can I even sing that song, right? And so the Babylonian Reformation, this is where they really have to think through, like, what does it even mean to be Jewish if we don't have all of this stuff? And this is key in transitioning to the New Testament, because when the temple is destroyed again, when the temple is in threat again, now they will have thought of what it means to be Jewish without the temple. And this is actually what sets up the spread of the church. Is this thought here of what does it mean to be Jewish without a temple? This leads to synagogue. This is where synagogue comes from. And synagogue is basically what church came out of. And so the way that we do church is essentially a modified version of synagogue, and we do that because synagogue came out of largely the Babylonian Reformation. So, does it make sense? Questions on this? Yeah, everyone okay?
Have you heard of Chuck Missler?
Yeah. I saw an interview with Stephen Colbert was interviewing Robert Downey Jr. And Robert Downey Jr. is apparently a really big fan of Chuck Missler, which I was like, what on earth is even happening right now? What's that?
I would never have thought.
No, me either. Like, he said that, and I was like, I need to rewind because I don't think I heard what I just heard. Like, that is not. Yeah. So, what were you gonna say?
My parents took me through like the whole Testament, New Testament, Old Testament, all that
Yeah.
stuff. And that just takes forever.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. Yeah, he's a smart dude.
Old dude.
So.
Old dude.
We don't know who that is. I don't know who that is.
Oh, he's a Bible teacher from, like, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, a while ago.
Right.
In depth,
Yeah.
like really in depth and all.
Yeah,
Is he still alive today? Because I knew his wife passed
nope.
away.
2018 looks
I
like.
don't know why the last name, Missler, it seems like I've probably read that name somewhere, but I have not checked, so I don't know.
Yeah. So, learn the Bible in 24 hours.
Learn the Bible in 24 hours.
Hidden treasures of the Bible.
It's like,
Yeah. So, yeah.
All right.
But he was really, really popular in like the 80s and the 90s. And less so eventually, you know. But
yeah, he made like a whole like Bible study
Mhm.
that like lasted forever.
Yeah.
My dad had
so apparently he's Robert Downey Jr.'s favorite Bible scholar, which I didn't even know Robert Downey Jr. would have
I
a
didn't
favorite
even
Bible scholar. I just wouldn't have even thought.
Right.
Wouldn't have even thought that was a thing. So, yeah. So, cool. Okay, well, let's go ahead and take a break.